Heart Story warmly welcomes you. Some mornings feel like any other, until something quietly extraordinary appears. On a quiet spring morning in Maple Hollow, retired mailman Thomas Bell was dusting off old boxes in his attic when he stumbled upon a photograph tucked between yellowed envelopes. The image was faded but still vivid enough, a young boy standing proudly by a rural mailbox, summer sun glinting on his hair. Thomas paused. Something about the boy's face stirred a memory just beyond reach. He gently flipped the photo over and read the faint handwriting on the back, "For the one who never failed a delivery." A chill passed through him. He hadn't delivered mail in over a decade, but some connections, it seemed, didn't retire with the uniform. As Thomas clutched the photo, he couldn't help but wonder, who had left this behind, and why now? The next morning, his doorbell rang. Thomas shuffled to the door, still holding the mysterious photo. On his porch stood a man in his late 40s, dressed neatly in a blue flannel shirt, holding something wrapped in brown paper. His voice was calm, but carried a tremble. "Mr. Bell? I think this belongs to you." The man gently handed over the wrapped item. Thomas unwrapped it slowly, revealing the same photograph, only now, it was beautifully framed in oak wood, polished and new. His heart skipped. "How did you?" he began, but the man interrupted with a soft smile. "You delivered more than letters back then, sir. You delivered hope. And I've waited a long time to return this." Thomas stared into the stranger's face, and something flickered in his memory, those eyes. Could it be the same boy? But why had he come now? Before Thomas could speak again, the man said quietly, "May I come in?" Thomas stepped aside, wordlessly inviting the man in. The living room still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. As the man sat on the edge of the couch, he looked around with quiet reverence, as if the room itself held a memory he couldn't quite touch. "I'm David," he said, "David Kinley. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you." Thomas narrowed his eyes, searching decades of deliveries in his mind. The name stirred something faint but stubborn. "You delivered mail to our house," David continued. "My mom used to wait on the porch just to wave at you. You were the only person who smiled back." Thomas blinked. He remembered a small house at the edge of a gravel road, a shy boy and a tired woman who always offered iced tea. It was coming back now, slowly, like fog lifting. David leaned forward. "That photo? It's not just for you. It's a promise I made." David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, aged but carefully kept. He handed it to Thomas with both hands. "This was the last letter my mother ever wrote," he said gently. "She asked me to find you, no matter how long it took." Thomas unfolded the paper with care. The handwriting was familiar, slightly shaky but graceful. The letter spoke of gratitude, of how his small gestures, a warm greeting, a reliable visit, a kind word, meant the world to a mother who often felt invisible. She called him, "the thread that held our days together." Thomas read in silence, his eyes wet with memory. He hadn't known. To him, they were just stops on a long route. But to this family, he had been a lifeline. David's voice broke the silence. "She kept that photo because you were the only person who made us feel like we mattered." Thomas set the letter down slowly, his fingers trembling more from emotion than age. He looked at David, stunned. I never knew," he said softly. "I was just doing my job." David smiled sadly. "That's the thing. You never knew, but you did it anyway. You smiled when others didn't. You walked that extra step to the porch when my mother was too weak to fetch the mail. You whistled Christmas tunes when we had no tree. I remember all of it." Thomas leaned back, his mind unraveling memories he thought long buried. The cold winter mornings, the quiet rural roads, the houses with stories behind every door, he had carried more than envelopes. David continued, when Mom passed 2 years ago, I found the letter and the photo tucked into her Bible. Her last request was simple: bring this back to the one who gave us warmth. Thomas exhaled deeply. That warmth now filled the room. Thomas stood up slowly and walked over to the framed photo on the table. He stared at the boy beside the mailbox, eyes full of hope, chin tilted upward with quiet pride. "That was you," he whispered. "You were so small back then." David chuckled softly. "Small, but always watching. You were one of the few constants in our lives. When Dad left, the world felt shaky. But every day at 10:15, you'd come down that hill like clockwork. That steadiness meant everything." Thomas turned back, emotion lining his face. "I never imagined I was doing more than bringing the mail." David's voice lowered. "That's why I wanted to return this framed photo. To remind you, sometimes, the smallest things leave the deepest footprints." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes misty. "You've given me something today, David, more than I ever expected from an old photograph." Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, as if carrying the weight of that memory forward. The next morning, Thomas woke earlier than usual, a quiet energy stirring in his chest. He placed the framed photo carefully by the kitchen window where morning light touched it just right. The encounter with David had reopened something long dormant: purpose. Over breakfast, he found himself wondering about all the other faces he had passed on his route. The older woman who always left him cookies. The boy in the wheelchair who waved from the corner. Had he unknowingly left footprints in more lives? Driven by this thought, Thomas opened an old metal filing cabinet in his study. Inside were decades of route logs, handwritten notes, and even Christmas cards from past residents. Dust clung to the memories, but they were still there: names, streets, small details he had once cared about. He began sorting through them, page by page, as if piecing together a map not of streets, but of people. As Thomas sifted through the papers, one envelope caught his attention. It was addressed in careful cursive to Mr. Bell, our favorite visitor. No return address. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a short note, dated 1989. "Thank you for always asking how my mom is. She says your smile helps her fight the pain. You may be the only reason she gets out of bed to wave each morning." No name. Just that. Thomas stared at it for a long while. He had no memory of receiving this. But the word struck him deeper than he expected. He placed the note beside the photo of young David. One letter, one face. How many more were there? Quiet thanks left unspoken. His fingers traced over the old route map taped to the wall. Suddenly, it didn't look like a job anymore, it looked like a trail of impact. And perhaps, he thought, it wasn't too late to walk parts of it again. Inspired, Thomas grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the morning chill brushing his cheeks. The familiar streets of Maple Hollow stretched before him, but today, they felt different, like they were waiting. With the old route map in hand, he walked slowly toward the neighborhood where he'd once delivered daily. Houses had changed, new paint, new porches, but some details remained. The red swing set by the tall oak. The wind chime that still jingled on Mrs. Patterson's porch. With each step, memories resurfaced like old friends waving hello. At one house, a woman watering her flowers looked up and gasped. "Mr. Bell? Is that really you?" Her voice cracked with surprise. Thomas smiled. "I'm just retracing my steps." She rushed forward and hugged him. "My mother always said you were the kindest man she ever met." As Thomas walked on, he felt it, his footsteps didn't just echo, they connected. Later that afternoon, David returned to Thomas's house with something in his hands, an old scrapbook wrapped in faded blue cloth. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. "My mother kept it all these years." Inside were dozens of clippings, newspaper snippets, photographs, even little notes from neighbors. But what stunned Thomas most were the pages filled with drawings, crayon portraits of a mailman, always smiling, walking up a gravel path. "I drew these when I was a kid," David laughed softly. "Every time you came by, I'd grab my crayons after you left." Thomas turned a page and paused. There, taped next to a photograph of a mailbox, was a child's shaky handwriting, "Mr. Bell brings the sun, even when it rains." Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't know I mattered that much," he whispered. David placed a hand on his shoulder. "You mattered more than you'll ever know." As they turned more pages, a photo slipped out and fluttered to the floor. David picked it up, surprised. "I've never seen this one," he murmured. It showed young David standing beside his mother, holding a small homemade sign that read, "Thank you, Mr. Bell." Thomas's eyes widened. He remembered that day now, just barely. He had come by with a small toy airplane for David's birthday, something he'd picked up at a garage sale. "Your mom had tears in her eyes," he recalled. "I thought maybe I'd overstepped." David shook his head, smiling. "She cried because no one else remembered. Not even our family. But you did." The scrapbook, the letters, the framed photo, it was all beginning to feel like a mosaic of gratitude he'd never known existed. David said quietly, "She saved these to remind me that even ordinary people can be extraordinary, without ever realizing it." Thomas closed the scrapbook gently, his hands lingering on the cover. "Your mother, she was remarkable," he said, voice low. "And you've honored her memory in a way few sons ever could." David looked out the window for a moment, then turned back. "She made me promise, before she passed, that I'd find you. That I'd tell you how much you meant. She said her last peaceful moment was watching you wave that final day, knowing someone out there truly saw her." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. So many years, so many faces, and yet, this one had circled back to say thank you. "I don't know what to say," Thomas whispered. David smiled. "You already said it, sir. Every day you showed up, rain or shine, that was the message." Thomas nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he felt seen not just as a mailman, but as a thread in someone's story. That evening, Thomas sat alone in his living room, the scrapbook resting on his lap. He stared at the fading light casting long shadows across the floor, memories flickering like candlelight. Something tugged at him, an urge to remember more. He pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook from his drawer. It was his old route log, filled with scribbles, house numbers, and small notes like "elderly woman, check mailbox visibility," or "family just moved in, wave hello." As he flipped through it, one entry stood out, "Kinley, mother ill, boy quiet but watches everything." Thomas traced the words with his finger, surprised by his younger self's attention to detail. A flood of other names followed, people he hadn't thought about in years. Each note held a spark, a forgotten moment of kindness or routine. But now, they felt like pieces of a larger story he had unknowingly written. And that story, he realized, wasn't finished yet. Driven by a quiet determination, Thomas marked several names in his notebook, families he remembered fondly, households where small exchanges had once meant so much. Some names had faded with time, but others still burned brightly. One in particular caught his eye, the Halberts, porch swing, 2 girls, always left lemonade. He remembered the summer afternoons when the girls would leave him notes with drawings, little crayon hearts and "Thank you, Mr. Bell," scribbled in shaky letters. The thought stirred something within him. Maybe they still lived nearby. Maybe others did too. Thomas picked up his phone, an object he rarely used for more than weather updates, and began searching the names one by one. A few addresses were still active. Others had changed hands. But it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for everyone. Just someone. Someone who remembered. Someone who needed a reminder that kindness doesn't vanish, it just waits to be rediscovered. The next day, Thomas walked down Birch Lane, one of the oldest streets on his former route. The pavement had cracked with time, but the towering oaks still stood like sentinels. He paused in front of a pale blue house with a sagging porch swing, the Halberts' old home. Just as he was about to turn away, the front door creaked open. A middle-aged woman stepped out, holding a toddler on her hip. She froze, squinting. "Mr. Bell," she said, disbelief lacing her voice. Thomas blinked. "Jenny?" She nodded slowly, her eyes welling. "You used to bring us lemon drops. I still remember your whistle coming down the street." They sat on the porch swing, catching up, the toddler playing nearby. Jenny shared how her sister had passed but how their mother always said, "That mailman? He was an angel in uniform." Thomas smiled, deeply moved. The past hadn't forgotten him, it had simply been waiting to be revisited. A few days later, Thomas received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, one he hadn't seen in decades. It showed him in uniform, standing beside a mailbox with a little girl hugging his leg, grinning up at him. Tucked behind the photo was a note, "You once told me to dream big. I did. Thank you for believing in me, Dr. Emily Halbert." Thomas stared at the handwriting, stunned. Emily had been Jenny's younger sister, the quiet one with big eyes and an armful of library books. He remembered encouraging her, asking about the stories she read, telling her that smart girls changed the world. He never knew if those words stuck, until now. With shaking hands, he placed the photo beside the others. The pieces of his past weren't fading, they were coming back stronger, more vibrant. One photo at a time, the legacy he never meant to build was finding its voice. That evening, Thomas received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was young but earnest. "Is this Mr. Bell, the retired mail carrier from Maple Hollow?" "Yes," Thomas replied cautiously. "My name is Sam Torres. My grandfather passed away last week, and in his things, we found a box labeled, Mr. Bell, for when he comes back." Thomas felt his breath hitch. "Your grandfather's name?" "Luis Torres. You delivered his insulin every week." Memories returned swiftly, Luis on his porch, rain or shine, always offering a thank you and a story about his youth. Sam continued, "There's a letter in the box. And a small wooden plaque that says, 'To the man who brought more than medicine, he brought dignity.'" Thomas closed his eyes. He never thought of himself as a hero. But piece by piece, others had seen him that way. He agreed to meet Sam the next day, because this was no longer about the past. It was about honoring it. The following morning, Thomas met Sam outside a modest brick house on Willow Street. Sam handed over the weathered box with care, as if it were something sacred. Inside, Thomas found several items: a worn cap with the postal insignia, a folded newspaper clipping featuring his own retirement photo, and the plaque Sam had mentioned. But it was the letter that drew his full attention. Written in careful cursive, Luis's words read, "You were the only visitor I could count on. When my wife passed, the silence nearly swallowed me. But then I'd hear your footsteps, your whistle. And suddenly, I remembered I still mattered." Thomas sat on the porch step, overcome. For years, he'd thought of his job as routine, a service. But now, it was clear, he had been part of people's healing, their comfort, their survival. Sam sat beside him. "He waited for you. Every Thursday at 10. Thomas whispered, "And I never knew." A week later, David returned to Thomas's home, this time with a proposal. "I've been speaking with the town council," he began, excitement lacing his voice. "We want to organize something, a community tribute to your years of service." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A tribute? For delivering mail?" David nodded. "No, for delivering connection. For being the thread that held this town together when no one realized it." At first, Thomas hesitated. Recognition had never been his aim. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized, this wasn't just about him. It was about every quiet, unseen act that keeps people tethered to each other. He agreed, on one condition: I wanted to honor all the little things people do, the ones that don't make headlines but change lives. David smiled. Then let's show the town what kindness looks like when it comes full circle. And so, preparations quietly began for a day no one would forget. Word spread quickly through Maple Hollow. Former neighbors, grown children, and even grandchildren of families Thomas once served began sending in notes, photos, and voice messages. Some came with simple thanks. Others carried heartfelt memories. One message stood out, a video from a woman now living in Seattle. "Mr. Bell," she said tearfully, "I was the little girl who hid behind the rosebush every time you brought the mail. You never said anything, you just whistled and waved. I grew up believing strangers could be kind." The local newspaper caught wind of the story and featured Thomas on the front page under the headline, "The Man Who Delivered More Than Mail." Strangers began stopping him on the street just to shake his hand. For a man who had once walked the town quietly, the attention felt overwhelming, but also deeply moving. It was clear this tribute wasn't about nostalgia. It was about how invisible kindness becomes unforgettable. On the day of the tribute, the town square buzzed with quiet anticipation. A modest stage had been set up near the post office where Thomas had started his career. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly with familiar faces, some aged, some grown, all carrying pieces of the story Thomas never knew he had written. David took the microphone first. "We're not here today just for a retired mailman," he said, his voice steady. "We're here for a man who taught us that consistency is love, and that kindness, when unnoticed, is often the most powerful." Thomas was invited to speak, and though he rarely felt comfortable in front of crowds, he rose slowly, clutching the plaque from Luis. "I didn't know I mattered this much," he began, voice soft. "But maybe that's the beauty of ordinary life, it matters more than we think." Applause rose, but it was the quiet tears on many faces that said the most. That evening, long after the tribute had ended and the town square had emptied, Thomas sat on his porch beneath a sky brushed with lavender twilight. The framed photo of young David rested beside him, now joined by letters, drawings, and gifts from a community that had quietly carried him in their hearts for years. As the wind stirred the trees, Thomas reflected on the unexpected journey of the past weeks. He had delivered mail for 4 decades, never imagining that in doing so, he was also delivering something far greater: dignity, hope, and presence. A small car pulled up. Out stepped a teenage girl holding a notebook. "My grandma told me about you," she said shyly. "Can I write about you for my school paper?" Thomas smiled gently. "Of course. But write about them too, your grandma, your neighbors. Kindness doesn't end with me." The girl nodded, sat beside him, and began to listen as stories continued to unfold. The girl, Olivia, flipped open her notebook and asked, "When did you know you'd made a difference?" Thomas paused, then looked out at the quiet street. "I didn't," he said honestly. "Not until someone told me. That's the thing about kindness, you don't always see the ripple." He shared stories of rainy mornings, winter storms, birthdays remembered with postcards, and how a simple hello had once made a grieving widow smile again. Olivia scribbled furiously, wide-eyed, realizing she wasn't just writing an article, she was capturing a legacy. As stars blinked overhead, Olivia closed her notebook and said, "You turned a job into a gift." Thomas chuckled softly. Maybe the job was the gift. That night, she posted a photo of Thomas with the caption, "Meet the man who delivered more than mail, he delivered humanity." Within hours, it was shared across the town and beyond. The world may have moved on, but kindness, it seemed, was just getting started. Days later, Thomas received a card in the mail, handwritten, stamped, and addressed simply, "To the man who walked beside our lives." Inside were dozens of short notes from local schoolchildren, each one thanking him for something they'd only just learned about. One child wrote, "I want to grow up to be a quiet hero, just like you." Thomas read each message slowly, his hands trembling with emotion. He had spent a lifetime walking the same paths, never expecting applause or recognition. But now, every step he had taken seemed to echo back in voices younger than he ever imagined. As he placed the card alongside the others, he smiled to himself, not with pride, but with peace. His life had been ordinary, yes. But in that ordinary, he had quietly shaped something lasting. Sometimes, the strongest legacies aren't built in bold strokes, they're mailed gently, day by day. If you've ever wondered whether your small acts matter, they do. And they always will.